So without further ado, let's welcome to the stage James Lockyer from Microsoft,
Michael Moran from Microshare,
and Jacques Guigui from CBRE.
And please stick around and listen to the satellite session. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome. As you heard, I'm Michael Moran. I'm the Chief Marketing, Sustainability, and Risk Officer at Microshare. It's a smart building data governance startup based in Philly and London. My fellow conversationalists here today, James Lockyer, who is a sales director at Azure IoT for Microsoft. Got to be careful with the share soft. And my friend Jacques Guigui of CBRE here in France, who is the Chief Innovation and Technology Director. And I would like to start this program by just saying, you know, we all know there's a pandemic underway, but this session was originally pitched in 2019 by me to the Alliance, who I have, you know, I have to give enormous thanks to for pursuing sustainability early. In 2019, it wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't everybody's favorite, you know, investment strategy, ESG. So this was an innovative thing at the time, and now I look like Johnny-come-lately, thanks to the pandemic. But we're going to talk about it and talk about how the pandemic has affected it as well, because it had an enormous impact on the way we value technology and who values the data that IoT and LoRaWAN are able to create in the built world. So I thought I might start with giving you a quick you know, idea of who Microshare is. You may have seen, you know, we've been mentioned a few times in dispatches today, and I want to thank Microsoft for that. But, you know, the way that we view ESG is, you know, there's three obvious sections. There's the environment, which largely involves carbon footprint and climate change issues, and water conservation. There's the social aspect of ESG, which is a very broad, difficult to peg thing that goes everywhere from labor relations to whether you're responsive to customers, whether you interact and treat the communities that your business is in well, to the risks that might exist in your supply chain of things like child labor and all sorts of horrible human slavery, which does exist, and it's very, very horrible and very well hidden. And then the governance piece is really, you know, the kind of thing that in an American company you have to file with the SEC every year. It's the salaries, the amount of money you spend on things like risk mitigation and all sorts of things. But what we do at Microshare is we deploy at scale best-of-breed sensors around the built world in order to create data that didn't exist before, or to automate the kinds of data that in many companies they're hiring $250,000 and $300,000 a year staff to go around with a clipboard or to send surveys to different departments. It just occurred to us very early on that that's not an effective way to do this, and it doesn't happen in real time. And ultimately, in some dream world of mine in the future, there'll be a way to take that data, feed it right to the compliance department, feed it right to the regulator, because the regulators are now also driving the ESG movement. I'm going to turn this over to James in just a moment, but I just want to give you a sense of specifically the kind of things we do. So the Eversmart Energy is part of a suite of products we call Eversmart, which is a very granular way to monitor the consumption of water, natural gas, and electricity. It has some nice knock-on effects for predictive maintenance as well, but in the sense of ESG, this is the kind of data science 101 of ESG, consumption. You get some of it from your utility bill, but you don't get enough detail and granular data from a utility bill. And the incentives, frankly, are not to help you conserve on the part of the utility. So ultimately, what we do is submetering to a great extent, and we reveal patterns over time, seasonal patterns, daily patterns, times of day patterns, the effect of people who are in the building. How does that affect the temperature of a room or the amount of water that's used? And all of these things are meant to provide that kind of granular data that you can use to track your carbon footprint and track the sustainable progress of the business. The social data, though, and this is where I think it's most exciting to me, as a guy who's done some marketing in my life, I know that big companies are going, what are we going to say about our social ESG scores? And they go to the marketing departments. They tell them how great we are. Tell them how great our buildings are. Tell them how great we treat our employees. There's no empirical data, necessarily, to back this stuff up. And if you know anything about ESG, there's a thing called greenwashing, which used to be just a kind of a scarlet letter that would get thrown at people. Now it can be a regulatory fine, a pretty significant one, and a hit on your share price. So greenwashing is a giant risk for corporations now. The social data we create on air quality, on things like density in these spaces, on the way that recycling is handled, the way that people can interact through an IoT feedback station to report issues. These are actual pegs on which these companies can hang their hat when they make claims about how good they should be ranked in their social component in ESG. So that's our Eversmart suite. There'll be a little more about that as we get into the discussion, but I want to give James Lockyer the stage, and I'm going to move this forward for you, James.
Very kind of you. Thank you, Mike. Lovely. Cheers. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Really great to be here today with you all, so thanks for making the time to join us. As Mike mentioned, I'm James Lockyer. I work for Microsoft within our IoT business, looking after our industry and sustainability efforts for our partner ecosystem. I think for today's session, we wanted to highlight that the industries that we prioritize within the IoT business are really kind of centered around three core areas around manufacturing, energy, and smart buildings and places. Now, from a built environment perspective, we know that the built environment contributes to in the region of a 40% of CO2 emissions globally. We also know at the same time that the IPCC, for example, have recently highlighted that we are not on track with our global efforts to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees. We also know, in parallel with that our customers are under increasing pressure to declare what steps they are taking to reduce their energy emissions, to reduce CO2 emissions, and fundamentally support the transition to net zero. And Mike actually touched on this just a minute ago. It is so important for organizations to be able to declare what steps they are taking to support the transition to net zero, because their customers are watching, investors are watching, the markets are watching. And of course, the impact to elements such as share prices and general customer satisfaction are plain to see. And of course, what we're also seeing today are governments starting to mandate that businesses declare what steps they are taking. So, for example, in the UK, there was, I think from April the 1st this year, certain size businesses have to adopt the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure in terms of really declaring what their climate asset risks are and what steps are they taking. Just moving on to the next slide. So one of the key opportunities for us is really around digital solutions. And digital solutions, there's been some great research. So I think just last month, the World Economic Forum mentioned that digital solutions can help reduce carbon emissions by 20%. But of course, we need adoption of that. And we know, for example, that building energy management solutions, and again, Microshare have got case studies on this, Microsoft also have case studies here, where adoption of building energy management solutions is helping organizations to reduce their energy costs, to reduce emissions by between 15 to 25%. Now, we can't do that without the support of our partner ecosystem. And in particular, strategic partners like Microsoft and CBRE are really helping to connect up that value chain from an IoT deployment perspective, from the IoT sensors, devices, edge devices, the connectivity layer through LoRa, for example, all the way through to the cloud compute side, so with Azure IoT, but of course some of those cloud computing services like AI and machine learning. So as I said, those benefits are plain to see. And I think what is really important for us is that as you start to look at the impact that digital solutions can have and are helping organizations to really meet some of their sustainability goals, that in turn, of course, helps what we've been talking about just a minute ago in terms of not only being able to declare what steps you're taking, demonstrate from a data perspective how much you have been able to reduce your emissions or energy consumption by, but of course that has other knock-on effects. So for example, building energy management deployments have an incredible ROI, a fantastic payback, if you like, anywhere between 6 and 18 months, depending on the scale of the deployment. So I think one of the things that perhaps is an opportunity for us is to think about how do we drive broad systemic adoption of building energy management solutions. That is the challenge for us today, in that this is something that impacts pretty much every single industry. Every sector is impacted by climate change. Every sector has pretty much got to declare what steps they are taking to support that transition to net zero. And in our view, building energy management solutions are key to that, because that is one step to helping reduce your operational emissions. And that's one step towards demonstrating how you are making that transition to net zero for your business. And of course, it has those knock-on effects that we mentioned before, improving things like brand integrity and saving you energy costs in the long term as well. So with that, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to now hand over to Jacques, who is going to share more on how CBRE are approaching their ESG efforts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, James. Sustainability is a mandatory topic for all the companies around the world. It's not a nice to have anymore. CBRE, as the global leader of real estate services, with more than $27 billion and 100,000 employees globally across 100 countries, has a very important role to play. We develop a lot of efforts to help our clients to hit the targets for ESG. ESG, let's talk about ESG. You can see on these targets that, for example, water, for resource and waste, carbon and energy, it's really important to have the data. We focus on energy, for example, in France, the commitments to reduce energy consumption by 40% for 2030 is important to us to be able to have the capacity to prove what is the start point and what is the progress, the daily progress, if we want to hit the targets. For climate change resilience, let's talk about BMS. We have to modify the classic BMS by introducing artificial intelligence and to have a new system of predictive maintenance by using new sensor from IoT, not removing all the systems, but adapting the system with new sensors. For the social, we have to be careful for the comfort and well-being. Well-being, it's a very subjective topic, without any data to prove and to have some feedback. It's important to have some data from sensors, for example, to have the air quality sensors, or to have, for example, noise sensors. And if you want to have more service for occupants, for example, with a mobile application, it's important to show them if they have a seat available for working spaces in case of flex office or for the car park, just with the sensors, with the LoRa network. And finally, the governance needs to have some data to see what is the progress for today, the progress tomorrow, and we have to be able to publish it. It's important now to publish it with true data. Without data, governance, it's like a skipper who sails without a compass. Let's talk about data now. Data. We have plenty of data we see in the project with CBRE, with my clients, when we began with the workshop, which is a mandatory step before proposing anything. We discuss and we see a lot of data, but sometimes 90% serve to nothing because they are not useful. It's the reason we begin with him to analyze the need first and to focus on the data they need to have the targets which is possible to hit. And we are, in fact, between the client need and the technology. It's the reason I want to speak about technology now, because it's not necessary to have too much data, but it's necessary to have the right data on the systems. We work with the LoRa systems, with Microshare, and we use this system because it's important for us to optimize the cost and to optimize the data recording on the systems. And we use one method with them, which is a test and learn method. First of all, we identify new sensors, new technology, and we buy samples and we install them at CBRE headquarters, just near here, 900 meters. We put them on test for 2 or 3 weeks. And with Microshare, we have feedback from, for example, the networks, the quality of the data, what is the range between the sensor and the gateway, etc., etc. And after this period of tests, we decide if these sensors could be on the catalog we can propose to clients. We don't propose any sensors without this phase. And they can come to see at CBRE headquarters if they want to see the sensor before. And after this step, it's really simple because we unpack the sensor, we put it on site, we collect the data by recording on the network with a mobile application, with Microshare, and after it's really fast because it's recorded on the network and it's working with a mobile application with a client quite immediately. And the conclusion is that it's easy, it's fast, and it's safe because the network is totally encrypted from the beginning for the sensor to the dashboard with global encrypted networks which guarantee security for the client.
Thank you, Jacques. Thank you so much. And it is so important what Jacques just said about that last mile. That data itself will not change a lot if you don't act upon it. And that last mile, for instance, is why we just launched an app just today called ReactM, which essentially helps that data get into the hands of the staff that needs to react to it. And that linking of IoT and business process management has not always happened, and it's now you're seeing the big 4 consultancies and arms of people like CBRE and our partners at Microsoft start to think that whole holistic way through the process, because IoT ROI is really about the reaction of a corporate culture, a corporate organization to the data that it's newly getting. If it doesn't react, it doesn't see the ROI. So we're trying to prevent that, obviously. So very quickly, I'd like to just cue this quick video up. And I think this will kind of transition us into the discussion we want to have around, the pandemic, which I know we're all tired of, but it has had such a profound effect on all of the things we're discussing, but also on the other trends that have emerged during the pandemic, sometimes quite coincidentally. The tight labor markets, the changing of the guard demographically in the Western economies between the boomers like me, I'm a late boomer, and people of younger generations who just don't have the same attitude about work or about the place they work in or the desire to go to an office every day. And then, of course, you have this entire overlay of the ESG, sustainability and climate debate So much has changed, and this 2 years has been kind of integral to that. So without further ado, let me run this quick video, and then we'll get to the discussion.
Eversmart. It's what we all want to be. After years of lockdowns and isolation, we're ready to get back to work. To re-engage with friends and colleagues. To get out there and start living again. But we've learned a thing or two. We want to know more about the indoor spaces we spend so much of our lives in. How pure is the air? How packed is that conference room? How often is this restroom cleaned? How much of this real estate do we really need? That's where Eversmart comes in. Microshare's Eversmart solutions create the data that drives the new normal. Data for a world newly aware of the need to get indoor spaces right and to manage real estate assets in the most efficient, sustainable way. Want to know how much gas and electricity your facility is wasting? Eversmart Energy tracks those data points and water consumption too. Need to reassure returning staff about the safety and wellness of your facility? Eversmart Clean and Eversmart Air provide actionable data, feedback, and scoring to optimize indoor spaces and provide peace of mind to the people inside of them. And what about all that expensive, half-vacant real estate in your portfolio? Eversmart Space will identify the real value of your square footage, providing an opportunity for sharp cost savings and deep reductions in your carbon footprint. We've all been through a lot in the past few years. Building owners, landlords, and employers today face new pressures from tenants and staff to react to the tragic lessons of the pandemic and to embrace more sustainable approaches to space management. Microshare is working with global leaders in this movement, and we're looking to engage the leader within you. Be that woman. Be that guy. Be that team. Be Eversmart.
Ado, I wanted to return to the conversation, and I think what we were trying to do with that video is kind of encapsulate the enormous transformation that's taken place. The idea that you would tell your boss you're not coming to work today was something you just didn't do two and a half years ago, at least not in my life. But now it's part of the new normal. Some people hate that term, but it is a new normal. We're not going back to where we were. That poses its own problems for various business models, for center cities in the world, for transit systems. But reality may suck, but it's still reality. You have to deal with it. So we're trying to grasp that, get around it, get our minds around it. So I wanted to start by asking Jacques a question. Jacques, the big cities of the world in particular, but also state jurisdictions. So the state of Maryland today passed the toughest climate disclosure requirements in the United States. Just saw it on the news this morning. But municipal and regulators in cities around the world, including here in Paris, are beginning to demand data that previously didn't exist. And even landlords might have said it's none of your business. How is that affecting your clients and your enormous global portfolio?
Yes, we have a lot of demand on the data acquisition in all the projects. That means we find today digital in general is on all line of business. When we work with a landlord, when we work for the development project, of what we work with facility management, we need to adapt the new way of the building management by adding some data collection. That means we cannot remove everything, but we discuss with all the stakeholders to find the best solution to move from now to maybe in 5 years to have a new building management with a new DNA based on the digital on the building, and to be able to move to be reactive and reactive because it's proactive. Because sometime before, with some problem with the pandemic, we have to react. And today, we want to prepare the building for tomorrow to be proactive, to be just software to modify the behavior of the building. It's like a chameleon to be able to modify. It's an important difference to be careful of the carbon footprint of the digital too, because it's important to work with this leitmotif.
So we've seen that in our own interactions with clients and prospective clients. The term sustainability immediately gets the eyebrows to raise in most instances. We talked briefly before this event about the migration of these issues from the IT team and the facilities managers up the food chain in the corporate world to HR, to the general counsel who's worried about liability, to the CFO who has building footprint, real estate footprint. Why are we paying for all this, as the video asked? Are you seeing that as well in the Azure IoT practice?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, in fact, building on what Jacques said just now, we've been at a number of customer sites just the last couple of months where we are seeing firsthand from the deployments that our customers have done that they are now starting to consider the work patterns or the new work patterns as people start to come back to work. So they're able to monitor, obviously, through occupancy sensors, really the ebb and flow of people coming into the office. And so the real-world examples that I saw firsthand were that Mondays and Fridays, the offices aren't too busy. Tuesday to Thursday, they see more and more people coming in. And I'm going like this because there are kind of occupancy graphs that are showing each day, if you like, with a peak kind of Wednesday, Thursday. But actually, some of these organizations, they've just moved premises. It's highly energy efficient, so that's great. But of course, they're looking for cost savings or further cost savings. And this one organization, as I said, they just moved to 3 floors in a new building. They're now considering just shrinking to 1. But they're not going to make that decision yet because they want to see what happens as the pandemic hopefully recovers. Obviously, we're seeing more peaks at the moment. But I think that's really interesting because what they've also done, they're taking that occupancy data, but they're also overlaying that to support so many other aspects. So you mentioned air quality before. Air quality is a really hot topic for executives today. And this building in question, okay, it had plants everywhere, but it also had air quality sensors in every single room, even with like a feedback button on it as well, to highlight, if you thought there might be some degradation in air quality. But of course, air quality actually has an impact on productivity, and I think we've all seen studies on how good air results in much better productivity. But then, of course, there's the more classic elements, I think, like data around HVAC systems, lighting, etc. And of course, as you say, Mike, that has gone from being the facilities manager's kind of domain to now being top of the agenda for the C-suite, because of course, actually, all of this that we've just discussed underpins the company's commitments to sustainability and really talking about how they are thinking about reducing their energy consumption, but also from a COVID perspective, talking about how they're working with their employees, how they're looking after their employees, whether they're going to have a hybrid-style workplace or whether it's going to be, we're seeing it today. Organizations some are mandating you're back in the office now. So yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic when you think about COVID plus the whole kind of net zero transition.
This is one of the things we love about LoRaWAN is the ability to, you're basically trying to convince somebody to install a solution. So let's say it's air quality. Having done that and set up the LoRaWAN gateway, it's a marginal error, adding or carrying error to put occupancy sensors in as well, because the LoRaWAN gateways are already there. The correlation is where the data is so powerful. So the obvious case is, we are all little engines of carbon. That's what we do all day, is we create carbon and breathe it out. You go into a conference room, close the door, spend time in 20 minutes, an hour in there with 20 people, and the doors aren't open. The air quality should tell you, okay, it's time for a break. Get out. And that's, it didn't occur to me as a young employee in a 1930s skyscraper in New York that Snickers bar I had to have at 3 o'clock in the afternoon was my body beginning to shut down because of the poisonous air in the place. Jacques, you talked quite a bit in our previous conversation about occupancy and other data streams to transform the way CBRE manages buildings. Can you talk a bit about that?
About the management of building, yes. I can give you 2 examples. The first example is for occupancy, which is our 100% project. We work with occupancy with our client because it's normal, because after the pandemic, they don't know how many square meters they need for the future coming back to work. And this is a very good solution to equip the workspaces with the sensors and to be able to decide, for example, if we have a 65% of flex rate, to modify some spaces to adapt it to the new way of working, to be sure employees will be back to work. It's important, and to keep the talents too. And for meeting rooms, it's important because we prepare a POC with Microsoft today with a new camera, which is able to count how many people are located in a meeting room. And we can compare, we could cross the data with Microsoft Outlook, and we can know if they reserve a room for 5 people and they finally 2 people. And what we see today is we don't need any more very big meeting rooms. Most of the cases we have to divide into 2 small meeting rooms to put in new equipment to remote conversation with Teams, for example, and we can work with remote and local, the hybrid mode. This is for occupancy. Another example for facility management, if you want. We want to be sure everything is clean in the company. We have a mobile application when we can see red and green points. Free is green, red it's occupied. And that means they can focus on cleaning the red ones. And that means at the end of the day, everything is very clean. You increase the quality for the same budget. And another technical point, for example, for the maintenance, we can have some pressure, very technical sensors, but sometimes it's very difficult to have the feedback from the landlord for the building management system data. It's easier to put your own sensor. It's cheap, it's very easy, it's very fast. You put sensor for air filter, for example, and you have a notification if you have to replace it. That means better air and less energy consumption. These are 2 examples, but we have plenty of examples, if possible, from the classical presence sensor to the mousetrap, which is existing, connected mousetrap.
Yeah, we're in that too. So one of the things you mentioned was the cleaning advantages of this. We have an Eversmart clean solution, which when we deployed, I think we thought that the main ROI for our clients would be around maybe a little bit less chemical sprayed around, maybe a bit more specific knowledge of what they needed to clean on every day. But in fact, again, due to the pandemic in part, we've seen its enormous labor stretching capabilities. People are in that industry, the commercial cleaning industry, are having an enormously difficult time retaining people or recruiting people. And if anything, the demand among their clients for new methods of cleaning, more visible cleaning, different routines that show that you're cleaning a space after it's used, not at the end of the day. Those kinds of things require data. And the ROI is so quick for them now that it sells itself. It used to be kind of a complicated sale. And that's true of so many of the other things we're doing now. And I fail to find any explanation for it without the pandemic being part of that. We talked about retrofitting, James, and most of the buildings, I'd say, that we work in tend to be older buildings We do some, brand new builds, but most of it is retrofitting buildings as old as hundreds of years old sometimes. There's a prison in the UK, for instance. And but most of them are the 20th century classic office building. As the 20th century went on, they got to the point where you couldn't even open the windows, and really not a very easy place to retrofit from an air quality standpoint. What are you seeing in terms of the demand? It used to be difficult to get the landlord to commit to a capital expense to do something in a building like that because they didn't think it was possible and because they didn't see the ROI. Are you seeing a change in that?
Definitely, yeah. And I think actually a big chunk of that is down to some of the ease of being able to deploy building sensors these days. I think there's that phrase "lick and stick" of sensors today, where you literally pull off the little blue strip on the back, which kind of switches on the battery. You also then kind of remove the sticker, put it on the wall or the ceiling, and it self-provisions. And that is opening up much more engagement opportunity for that kind of retrofit space. It's always that kind of classic brownfield versus greenfield opportunity for us, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys as well. And I think what we find is that, of course, in the greenfield site, it's insane. A new tenant or the landlord itself is looking for the complete works of everything they can fit into that building. Tenants on each floor then can kind of pick and choose which of those services they want. On the brownfield side, it's in a way more interesting because you see the reaction in the room when those brownfield site owners, if you like, suddenly their eyes light up when they realize that they can do a lot more than they thought. They can put temperature sensors in the buildings. They can attach temperature sensors to radiators, for example, or they can measure air quality in different ways, occupancy in different ways. And I think that's really important because, of course, we have such a huge amount of aging building stock. And that has a huge bearing, of course, on things like we've been talking about earlier in terms of the transition to net zero. There are still so many capabilities that you can deploy in, I guess, or in kind of retrofit into older buildings, which I think is perhaps not well known enough. And perhaps it's a job for us to drive more awareness of that and talk about exactly how you can do that in older buildings, because obviously in newer it's more apparent.
I spent a couple of years of my life on the Microsoft campus, and those were very modern, brand new buildings at the time. I'm old now. They're probably getting a little old. But most of our buildings are these kind of, post-World War II, buildings of various degrees of quality and comfort. The landlords, we find very recently, probably within the last year, in some of the most famous of those buildings, in places like New York and Washington and Chicago, suddenly realized that IoT is not just something that'll help them save a little money on utilities or whatever. It's a differentiator in their marketing. It is a tenant retention tool, and it's a recruitment tool for their staff. These people who are coming out of the colleges that handle engineering and building engineering want to be involved in the cutting edge, and this is it. So we're seeing that kind of demand bubble up quite a bit. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes to. This is always dangerous because if you have no questions, it's very awkward. So please have questions. We wanted to do some Q&A. There are mics about halfway, a little more than halfway down each aisle. And I would ask that those of you who have a question, if you could come to the mic, just say who you are, and then hit one of us, and we will do our best to take these questions and give you decent answers. Come on. I didn't pre-cook this, so save me. I could have pre-cooked it. I just don't think that's cool. No questions. How many of you out there are in the corporate real estate or commercial real estate business? None. So we're all here as IoT technology professionals. Is that right? Well, I will say one more thing before we give you a couple of minutes of your life back. So I first of all want to thank James and Jacques for a lot of preparation that goes into a little conversation like this. We have had, do we have a question? Oh, thank God. Please.
Hello.
Hello.
How do you cope with privacy matters?
That's a very good question. I'm willing to jump in if you guys have thoughts. So we have been, you know, that was a very early concern that we had, and particularly acute in the early parts of the pandemic. And this is an interesting little anecdote. Right after the pandemic began, the term contact tracing became very well known. People suddenly understood what that meant. And by and large, it was a human endeavor. It was a detective phone call from a national health service or something. But we decided, after actually prompting from Microsoft, who introduced us to a client, GlaxoSmithKline, who didn't have the luxury of sending their workers home to work. They need to be creating pharmaceuticals in pharmaceutical plants. So we developed a wearable. I'm getting to the question, I promise. It's a wearable which was a Bluetooth beacon with a LoRaWAN backhaul. That raised questions. So we were going to essentially track people in this pharmaceutical facility anonymously. The actual technical term is pseudonymously, which means it was anonymous until someone called and said, I have symptoms. Then somebody, an HR director or somebody, could do a reverse database query and identify which other badges had been in contact, had a contact event with those people. That was, we felt, a much more honorable way to do that than putting it on your cell phone where you leave the office and the boss is still tracking you. So that was our approach to this. And I think during the period when that was a very popular product of ours, which is still out there working, we had no client that had a major shutdown of a plant as a result of a major outbreak. And you know, look, this was something we put together with the help of GlaxoSmithKline and Microsoft in a matter of 3 weeks to a month. So the privacy aspect, that was very much top of mind for us, because it occurred to us that the downside of the smartphone approach was not just privacy, because it collects PII, and we didn't, but it also, you know, batteries die. People don't necessarily have smartphones in the developing world. So that, and you can't have one on a production floor. So I hope that answers it a bit. We're very careful to be GDPR compliant. We do not collect PII. That's, I think, the be-all and end-all. I think if you get to the point where you're taking pictures of people or collecting PII, there's a new level of risk to somebody's privacy. Thank you so much for that question. It's an interesting topic. We've got 2 minutes. Anybody else? I see someone approaching. No. All right, folks. I want to thank James Lockyer, Jacques Guigui of CBRE, and all of you for coming and listening. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.